Okay, hello. All right, this is Jerome Deroy. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I'm going to talk about storytelling for onboarding. And let's see. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a particular system that we have created at Narativ, the company that I run. And this is a system to train new hires with stories from their peers. And so, as I said, I run a storytelling company called Narativ. And this idea of using storytelling for onboarding, it really came from a personal experience. One of my first jobs after business school was to work in the asset management department of a company called BNP Paribas, a large bank, international bank that some of you might have heard of. And on my first week there, I was 26 years old, and I was given 2 binders by the HR director, human resources director, big binders like this, and then I sat. They brought me to a room that didn't have any windows, a conference room, and I sat down. And I looked through these boundaries, and these were all compliance, transactional. What should you do? What should you not do? And for 2 days, I stayed in that room. I went home to sleep after the first day. But for 2 days, I stayed in that room and went through these binders. And I never met anyone in the company for those 2 days. And then after these 2 days, I finally met members of my team. And for the rest of the week, I sort of followed around one of the employees whose job I was eventually going to do. And about 4 years after that, I walked into my boss's office and I told him that I quit, that I wanted to resign. And so I left the company and I came to New York. And this is how I found what I'm currently doing right now, because I met my future business partner. That was about 16, 17 years ago. And when Murray, my business partner, when he asked me, why did you quit your job in banking? I said, I simply wasn't engaged. And with storytelling, what we see at Narativ is a way to engage people from their very first day. The onboarding system and programs that people have in their companies are the best opportunity to engage people, not just about compliance and what to do and what not to do, really to engage them about the culture of the company, their team members, and even their role. So this is who we are at Narativ, and you can read here. I've given you a little bit of a story, but essentially what we have at Narativ is we've created a methodology for listening and storytelling, which has been used in many different sectors, different environments. Onboarding is one of the places where we work, but we also work in presentation coaching, leadership development, team building, and really the key idea here is that listening and telling are mutually influential. And what that means is that even though I cannot hear you or see you, I can hear the translator who's doing a wonderful job, but I can't see you or hear you. And so as a result, I don't know what the listening exactly is like. I can see a chat box and I can see, Russian language on the side of my screen. And yet there is something that's communicating. I know that you're listening. I can see all these proof points that you're listening to me. And so that is informing how I'm speaking. Even having a translator is informing how I'm speaking. I'm speaking perhaps more slowly than usual, with a little bit more space between my words. So this is one of our key ideas. And it's really, really important to remember when we delve into storytelling, the first thing to look at is listening. So this is all in our book, Powered by Storytelling, which was written by my business partner, who you will hear from during this conference as well. He's going to talk about storytelling in the future. So why story for onboarding? So I gave you a little bit of a story, my personal experience. But what I didn't say in that story is that every 6 months, people would walk into my managing director's office and they said they quit, same as me. And my boss would always tell me, well, I know that they quit because other people pay better. And for some it was true, but for most people it wasn't true. For most people, it came from inefficient programs that didn't engage their employees. And this led to a lack of role clarity, some mistakes that were avoidable in the first month, a weak cultural assimilation, and even a loss of revenue. Just to give you some statistics here to support this, only 2/3 of workers are satisfied with their jobs overall. 46% of workers are satisfied with their particular jobs. So that means that a majority actually of people are not satisfied with their jobs. And roughly 1/5 of workers are dissatisfied and likely to quit their role in the next year. So that means that only after a year, there's already 20% of your workforce that's ready to quit. And so this is why we feel that onboarding provides such an opportunity to engage people very quickly. So I'm going to give you a case study for the rest of this webinar, these next 15 minutes or so, from an organization that we worked with called Measures for Justice. You can see it here on the screen. And I'm being told to switch on my webcam. So let's see if I can do that. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm going to continue without the webcam because I'm having a problem here of connection. So Measures for Justice is an organization that we worked with specifically on their onboarding program. And this is an organization that is a research organization. And it specializes in measuring the criminal justice system in the United States. This means, I'll explain just a little bit of background. Here in the US, you have states, and then you have cities, and you have counties around those cities. And in those counties, you can, every county kind of operates differently when it comes to the criminal justice system. There's a judge, a prosecutor, a defender, lawyers, etc. But every county is very, very independent, and there's no way of measuring what one county does versus another. And so Measures for Justice has a data outreach team that travels around the country and that meets with people on a local level in every county to gather their data so that they can put it in one database that is shareable with all 3,000 counties in the USA. So as their team grew in size and in geography, they needed to train all of these new hires because, they've gone from being a 2-person team to being 60 people and growing. So the big question that they were asking was, how can we help new hires understand what their job is going to look like from their very first day? And what we needed to do was to develop something that was not just in person, because that wasn't enough. Their traditional way of training people, new hires, was to have them follow the person who had done their job before, so that they could really see how does this work. So every new hire would follow someone for 3 to 6 months until they were ready to do their job. But when you have 10 or 15 people a year that are coming in for that same role in different places geographically, between California and New York, you have a 6-hour plane ride and thousands of miles. And so you can't do that kind of training anymore. So the first thing we had to do was to find a remote onboarding program, a remote way of training these new hires. And then we had to still keep the human aspect of this, which was so important to the culture of this company. So that's why we concluded that instead of actors or hosts, or even myself as a consultant, we would use employees of the company and coach them to tell stories about their job and about situations that these new hires would very likely encounter in the field. So in this slide, I'm sharing a little bit of the process here, and I'm doing this in the hope that you can implement some of these processes and practices, and I'll get to that at the in a little bit in a few slides. But here, this is what we did with them. We start with discovery, where we essentially interview people, find story themes, determine scenarios, and then we did a group workshop with the core team to deliver our methodology and identify who should be the people telling stories in this platform. Once we found those, then we coached them, the storytellers, according to these different scenarios. So for example, one scenario was, what do you do when you encounter someone who's really reluctant and resistant to sharing information with you? And because this had happened to someone, one of these storytellers, we asked them to tell us the story of how they navigated that situation. And we used our methodology to teach them how to tell that story. So then that led us to creating a story library where you can build stories on video, podcasting even, and add learning content. And I'll show you what that looks like. Then the new hires went through that whole story library and the content. And finally, what happened afterwards, people went into the field, did their jobs, and we were told that a year later, one of these new hires remembered the story that she heard on this platform when she was in a similar situation in the field. And so she knew what to do immediately in that moment. And the final step here is that the story library evolves into a searchable resource, right? So this was 3 years ago. A year ago, we came back to actually refresh the story library and find new storytellers who could tell new stories. And some of those new storytellers had been new hires 2 years before. So now you kind of see a perspective for yourself that you might be on this platform as well. You might be the one telling stories that can be helpful and useful for others to do their jobs better. So this is what the platform looks like when it's audio. So it consists of modules, and you can see that there's learning content on there with different, with a summary of different points. You can also see that there's an area where you can listen to the story. So this was done, this particular module was done just like a podcast, which, here in the USA, many people listen to podcasts. And so as a result, because of people being quite young in this company when they come in, they're in their 20s and 30s, they're very used to listening to podcasting. So we also adapted what is the best medium for this audience. And so we created modules in the style of a podcast with music, with a host, and then the employees telling their stories. Another example of this is we also evolved it into video. So here you see one of those employees telling a story about something that happened that could be useful for a new hire. So really, as you can see, as a new hire, you're seeing your own new colleagues, your own team, telling you stories about what it's like to be in this role, what it's like to be in this company, what the values of this company are, what the culture of this company is. And what we're hearing back as a result of this program is that people feel much more a sense of belonging, that there is a reduced learning curve. In this case, it went from 6 months to be able to learn your job to 6 weeks. So that's a drastic reduction, avoiding some of those mistakes that you make in your first few months, because now they knew what those mistakes were and how they could solve them. It also measures the compatibility of a new hire with your culture. So you can find out when people come in, there's a big issue here in the US and I think in many parts of the world with retaining employees and keeping them on board for a long time. And that often comes from a mismatch between the culture and the new hire. And so here you have a way of really quickly finding out if the new hire is right for your culture and if the culture is right for the new hire. And finally, it also helped to build relationships between new hires and their managers. As a result of this program, many more conversations happened between new hires and their managers that were much more pointed and specific. And many times before this program, there was reporting that, some of these meetings could be vague or very broad, but not specific enough to the role of the new hire. Now, because of this program, new hires knew exactly which questions to ask, and the managers knew what the new hires had gone through. And so they knew exactly where to guide them. So some of the benefits of thinking for yourselves about storytelling for onboarding particularly, really is about creating a membership messages that people can learn from. It's also about, how do I create a real world picture of what it's like to work in this organization? And putting knowledge seekers, in this, we draw a lot from knowledge transfer theory. And there is such a thing as knowledge seekers and knowledge originators. So those who look for knowledge and those who have the knowledge. And how do you put those two together? And for us, this marries perfectly with listening and storytelling, because you can equate a listener as someone who's looking for knowledge. A storyteller is someone who has knowledge and is ready to share it. So what we're simply doing is putting these knowledge seekers together with these knowledge originators as listeners and storytellers and creating a dialogue between the two. Too often in companies, the knowledge originators, those who have the knowledge, they leave the company without leaving their knowledge behind. And so as a result, when someone leaves, all of their knowledge leaves with them. And that's a huge loss for the company. So this is a way of retaining that knowledge and then sharing that knowledge. Very helpful to also think about this in terms of legacy. If you own a company and your company's growing and you're thinking of retiring, what of your knowledge is going to be kept into that company? Capturing the stories of those who have that knowledge, of the founders of the company, could be a fantastic way to keep the legacy of the company alive. Otherwise, it's also about discovering connections between things that you may not have seen as related, but now are related. And then, of course, replacing costly and time-consuming knowledge-sharing workshops, which is interesting because my business model as a company traditionally has been to go in and do workshops with people around presentations, around sales and leadership and team building. With this, what we found is that was not the appropriate solution. The appropriate solution was to find people within the company who already had the stories, coach them on one-on-one so that they could share their knowledge. And workshops were not as efficient, as effective. So this can replace that. And then, of course, it creates a training that you can iterate based on new information, and finally transform data-heavy presentations into much more relatable and memorable story content, right? So you can imagine that those two binders that I talked to you about earlier on this webinar of my experience, well, now these two binders are transformed into relatable and memorable stories, right? Now, what would that have done for me as an employee instead of being for 2 days in a room on my own, reading through these compliance binders? And I was actually listening to stories from my colleagues of what it's like to work there. It would have changed everything for me. So in terms of how you can do this yourself, just a few best practices here, and I hope this is helpful to all of you. First of all, it's really about identifying people who have the knowledge, who've got that on-the-job experience. And then it's about hearing directly from people who've got that knowledge. So, you interview them, then you want them to actually share their story of the knowledge that they have. And of course, you have to help them. So you have to coach them into, finding those right moments, finding those specific moments, those scenarios, those situations that they've been in that will be helpful for those who are seeking that knowledge, right? And this is where having that methodology is really helpful. So I encourage you to get our book because that's where our methodology is. But even beyond that, I think, one of the small things I can tell you now is that when you are interviewing someone and trying to get a story from them, just asking them what happened and asking them to be specific about moments and people and situations, that will already give information to those who are listening. That's really, really helpful and much more specific than, a job description, or relatable mostly. And then, of course, you derive lessons from those stories. That's where the analysis comes in, and you follow up with the new hires that are hearing about their experiences on the job. So once people have learned and gone through this platform and now they go into the field, we're going to want to hear from them. How is their experience on the job? How did this impact them? What are their stories now? What are they learning on the job? So that you can create a cycle of learning. This is the last year of new knowledge seekers. In terms of telling stories, telling what happened and direct people to stay away from feeling statements, abstractions, and jargons, that creates clarity, right? So you can picture the two binders that I was talking about, a windowless room. Those are the kinds of details that make the story memorable and relatable. And to let the stories speak for themselves instead of predetermining what you think your team needs to hear. And finally, to connect the stories to each person's role. Make it very clear why you're telling these stories, what the purpose is, and how it connects with people's new role. So one of the last slides here is just in general the story cycle. You start by finding stories that represent the company. Then you interview the people who have those stories and you capture them. Really important to capture those, whether it's audio, video, and now you can do that very easily even with a phone. You deliver that media through an online courseware or some kind of platform that's shareable with everyone, using that for onboarding and recruitment. Many people, I've heard of people who quit their job during the onboarding process because they weren't satisfied with the onboarding process and they went with another company because they preferred that company's onboarding process. So even for recruitment, this is really helpful. And then, of course, this involves your company identity and its culture because these stories are what create the culture. So now you're much more in control of that story, of the larger narrative of your company. You've got a system to actually cycle these stories. So this is us at Narativ, and I really want to thank everyone for listening today. I'm sorry about the technical difficulty where I couldn't be seen, but my computer told me that I should turn off the video so that the connection would be better. I'm seeing, so let's see, are there any questions here? Yes, I see some questions here. One of them says, Jerome, could you give examples of company stories themes and how to motivate people to share their experience? Great. So maybe I'll just take a few minutes here to answer that. So yes, examples of company stories themes. So for example, with this company that I was talking about here with Measures for Justice, one of the themes was difficult client situations. That was a theme, right? Another theme was success stories where we actually managed to get through to a client or we managed to successfully sell a difficult service to sell, right? So these vary. Those are kind of the usual ones that we look at is where were the challenges and where were the successes? So even if it's just those two themes, challenges and successes, there's many, many lessons to learn from. And usually everyone has a story of something where they messed up, where they made a mistake. That was another one of our themes, mistakes made and how we learned from them. And then how to motivate people to share their experiences. That's a really great question. And that comes to me from listening. And the more you can create an environment in which the listening is supportive and safe. And what that means is to create a space. So what we often talk about in Narativ is creating a dedicated time and space for listening and storytelling. And what that means is you find a room, you talk to a person one-on-one and you tell them how long the meeting is going to be, even if it's just 15 minutes. So we've got 15 minutes and you have my listening for 15 minutes and you tell them what you're interested in learning about. And then you ask questions that are really related to what happened as opposed to questions about, why did you make that mistake or why were you successful here or why was this challenging, but rather what happened? What did that person say that was challenging to you? What was the moment when you knew that you had succeeded, right? and ask people to tell you about those specific moments, because that, if you ask questions that are of that nature, then people will be more motivated to answer you, right? Because it's simply asking them what happened, really. And also I think the other piece of motivation is to give them a perspective. You're not simply doing this for yourself, or to talk about yourself, or for the good of the company, actually. You're doing this so that the new person who is going to be in your shoes, who's going to be doing what you did, so that they can learn, they can be better thanks to you. And so it's really about kind of lifting them up and their role in taking on a new responsibility in the company. And that new responsibility is almost like a mentor, really, except that you don't necessarily need to be there in person. What we need is your story. And your story will be that sort of gold that someone else needs to do their job better. And then, of course, giving them perspective that, a year from now, that story that you told is still going to be on our platform, and you are becoming one of the voices and faces of this company. So going a little bit from anonymous to now, being front and center in the company, even though you're not the CEO, you're not the founder, you're not one of the main leaders of the company, and yet your voice matters. I think that's really ultimately what motivates people the most, to share their experience. All right, great. Well, I think that's my time. I really want to thank everyone for tuning in and listening. And please, my email is on this slide here, Jerome@narativ.com. Our website is there. So please don't hesitate to email me with questions. I'd be happy to take questions. I see there are more questions, but we're out of time. And yeah, please do send those questions, and I'll be happy to send answers back even to the organizers, so that you guys can benefit from that. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time.